September 7, 1940, somewhere in the Midlands. The train didn't exist. Not on any map the Luftwaffe had studied. Not in any intelligence file spread across planning tables in occupied France. The locomotive crawled through darkness at 30 miles per hour, its Welsh anthracite burning clean, producing almost no smoke. Above the rails, suspended on wooden poles invisible in the blackness, camouflage netting formed a false canopy. From 5,000 feet up, where German reconnaissance aircraft flew their photographic runs, there was nothing to see. Just the unbroken shadow of Sherwood Forest, ancient and unchanging. The 15 wagons behind the locomotive carried 25-pounder artillery pieces, enough firepower to equip an entire battery. They were moving south toward Dover, toward the coast where Hitler's invasion barges waited across the channel, and they were moving on rails that, according to every German map, every captured document, every intelligence assessment, simply did not exist. Before we go further into this story, if you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Britain's most successful secret. The train's engineer, a 52-year-old veteran of the London and North Eastern Railway named Thomas Webb, had signed the Official Secrets Act 3 months earlier. He'd been told that if he spoke about these routes to anyone, his wife, his children, his closest friends, he would face imprisonment. He'd been told that the lives of thousands of soldiers depended on his silence. He'd been told that the trains he would drive for the next 5 years would never appear in any timetable, never stop at any public station, never be acknowledged to exist, and in that moment, rolling through the manufactured darkness with a cargo that could change the course of battles, he understood something the Germans never would. Britain hadn't just prepared for this war. Britain had built an entirely separate country to fight it, a ghost nation of hidden railways, invisible depots, and phantom supply lines that would keep the military machine running even if every conventional rail line in England burned to ash. The Germans were bombing the Britain they could see. They would never find the Britain that actually mattered. The story began 4 years earlier, in conference rooms where men in civilian suits contemplated nightmares with the dispassionate efficiency of accountants calculating losses. It was April 1937, and the Air Ministry had just received a classified study that should have terrified anyone who read it. The question had been simple enough. What happens to Britain's military capability if the railways stop working? The answer had arrived in a leather-bound report that weighed 3 pounds and contained 600 pages of analysis, maps, and calculations. Every conclusion pointed to the same catastrophe. Britain's railway system was magnificently efficient and utterly doomed. The entire network converged on obvious choke points that any moderately competent bomber could identify from 5 miles up. London alone had 15 major stations, each one a target that couldn't be missed. Destroy the junctions at Crewe, Rugby, York, and Doncaster, and you'd effectively cut Britain in half. The army depended entirely on rail transport for strategic movement. Tanks couldn't drive themselves 300 miles from factories to ports. Artillery pieces, ammunition, fuel, food, everything the military needed moved by train. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. If Germany gained air superiority and systematically destroyed the rail network, Britain's ability to defend itself would collapse within 3 weeks, not months. Weeks. The study's authors, railway engineers borrowed from the London, Midland, and Scottish Railway, had done their work thoroughly. They'd calculated tonnage requirements, transit times, alternative routes. They'd examined every possible scenario for maintaining military logistics if conventional railways came under sustained attack. Every scenario ended the same way: defeat. But buried on page 473 was a different kind of conclusion. A radical proposal that violated every principle of efficient railway management. Build a parallel system, not to replace the civilian railways, but to shadow them. Create a network of military-only lines connecting factories to depots, depots to ports, training areas to embarkation points. Make these lines difficult to spot from the air, impossible to find on captured documents, and redundant enough that destroying one section wouldn't cripple the whole system. The proposal reached desks in Whitehall where practical men did practical mathematics. The cost would be enormous. Estimates ran to £40 million, nearly $500 million in today's currency. The construction timeline would stretch over years. The entire project might prove unnecessary if war never came. They approved it anyway. In June 1937, under provisions so classified that even most members of Parliament weren't briefed, construction began on what would eventually be called the Strategic Reserve Railway System. The name itself was camouflage, bureaucratic language designed to sound boring enough that no one would ask questions. What it actually represented was one of the war's most ambitious deception operations, a project that would eventually comprise over 400 miles of hidden track. The first rails went down in the Midlands, threading through industrial landscapes where additional rail spurs wouldn't look suspicious. Engineers surveyed routes that violated every principle they'd been taught. Conventional railway engineering demanded efficiency, straight lines, gentle curves, the shortest distance between points. Strategic railway engineering demanded invisibility. The lines meandered deliberately, taking the long way around hills instead of cutting through them. They paralleled existing roads at odd angles that made no economic sense. They disappeared into what looked like warehouse districts, but were actually elaborate camouflage structures hiding marshalling yards. A Birmingham tank factory that should have connected to the main line via a quarter-mile spur instead got a strategic railway branch that curved 3 miles through Warwickshire woodland, emerging at a depot disguised as a brickworks. Camouflage became an obsession, an art form practiced by theatrical set designers recruited from London's West End. They approached the problem with a stage designer's understanding that what the audience sees from the balcony matters more than what exists on stage. Rails and sleepers got coated with matte pigments matching local soil colors. Nothing could eliminate the linear feature entirely, but reducing contrast made photo interpretation exponentially more difficult. More elaborate installations used netting suspended on poles, creating false canopies that from above looked like continuous forest. These required constant maintenance. Trees had to be woven into the netting to match seasonal changes. When snow fell, teams would spread white sheeting within hours. German photo analysts studying reconnaissance images saw unbroken woodland, never suspecting that beneath the canopy, trains moved every night. The most sophisticated deception involved building fake structures next to real ones. A strategic depot might sit adjacent to what appeared to be a brick factory, complete with smokestacks that occasionally produced real smoke. The brick factory was entirely hollow, a theatrical set constructed to draw attention away from the nondescript buildings where ammunition was actually stored. Luftwaffe bombers attacking the obvious target would devastate an empty shell while the real facility 200 yards away, looking like agricultural storage, remained untouched. The Germans would study their bomb damage assessment photographs, see the destroyed brick factory, and mark the target as successfully eliminated. Meanwhile, trains would continue loading ammunition from buildings the Germans had never identified as significant. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war, the Strategic Reserve Railway System comprised roughly 400 miles of track. Not an impressive figure compared to Britain's 20,000 miles of conventional railways. But those 400 miles connected every critical node in the military supply chain, and they'd been built with operational security that bordered on paranoia. Construction crews worked in isolated sections, never seeing the full route. Railway workers assigned to strategic lines signed the Official Secrets Act and faced blunt warnings about consequences of loose talk. Even the materials had been sourced carefully. Rails came from multiple suppliers to avoid creating a paper trail. Sleepers were mixed batches of wood and concrete to prevent distinctive patterns being spotted from the air. The system's first real test came not from German bombs but from British chaos, and it was nearly a disaster. In September 1939, the military's mobilization plan called for moving 2 infantry divisions from Yorkshire to Southampton for embarkation to France. Someone suggested using the strategic network. Trains got lost because signalmen weren't familiar with the new routes. A locomotive broke down on a stretch where no maintenance facilities existed. One train full of soldiers spent 6 hours stationary in a camouflage siding, while officers tried to figure out where they actually were. The operation that should have taken 12 hours stretched to 3 days. The army was furious. Some officers argued the whole concept was an expensive boondoggle that complicated logistics instead of simplifying them. The criticism had merit. A secret railway network is only useful if people know how to use it. But Dunkirk changed everything. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, over 338,000 British and Allied troops evacuated from France through desperate rescue operations that became legend. They arrived in England with essentially nothing. The British Expeditionary Force had left behind its tanks, its artillery, its trucks, everything that couldn't fit on the rescue ships. Britain's army came home, but Britain's army's equipment was scattered across French beaches or sitting abandoned in Belgian fields. The industrial response was frantic. Factories that had been producing equipment at peacetime rates suddenly needed to replace an entire army's worth of material. Tank production doubled, then tripled. Ammunition factories ran 3 shifts. And the strategic railways, dismissed by some as expensive paranoia just months earlier, suddenly became indispensable. The Luftwaffe provided urgent motivation. The Battle of Britain began in July with German fighters attacking Channel convoys, expanded in August to RAF airfields, and in September shifted focus to London itself. The Blitz had begun, and with it came sustained attacks on British infrastructure. Railway stations burned. Goods yards exploded. Junction points twisted under high explosives. On the night of September 7, 1940, German bombers hit London's docklands. The fires could be seen from 50 miles away. St. Catherine docks, Surrey commercial docks, and every railway serving them were devastated. Over the following weeks, the pattern became grimly predictable. German bombers would appear after dark, guided by rivers reflecting moonlight. They'd find cities by the glow of previous fires. They'd drop high explosive and incendiaries on anything that looked important. Railway installations, with their distinctive patterns of parallel lines converging on large buildings, were impossible to miss. Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Coventry all took repeated hits. By the end of 1940, over 9,000 separate incidents had affected Britain's railways. Bridges collapsed, stations burned. Tracks twisted by explosions lay waiting for repair crews who worked under threat of renewed attack. This was exactly the scenario the strategic network had been designed to address. While repair crews struggled to restore conventional lines, military traffic shifted to the hidden system. The ghost network came alive. Trains that didn't exist carried cargo that couldn't be tracked, moving through a landscape that looked unchanged to German reconnaissance. The system worked because it embraced a fundamental principle of deception. The best way to hide something is to make people believe there's nothing to hide. Thomas Webb, rolling his artillery trains south through the autumn darkness of 1940, was part of an operation repeated nightly across England. His route took him through Sherwood Forest, where centuries-old oaks provided natural concealment. The line skirted villages, always staying just out of sight behind tree lines or embankments. At several points, the train passed under camouflage structures built to look like agricultural barns. These weren't just netting, they were actual buildings with walls and roofs, hollow inside but appearing solid from above. Anyone driving past on adjacent roads saw what appeared to be a normal farm building. German reconnaissance aircraft photographing the road network saw nothing suspicious. The train continued south through Leicestershire into Northamptonshire, moving through a night made brilliant by searchlights sweeping for German bombers that never came close enough to spot the slow-moving freight below. By dawn on September 8th, Webb's train reached a strategic depot near Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire. The depot itself was a masterwork of camouflage, what appeared from above to be agricultural buildings surrounding a country estate. It was actually a major ammunition and artillery storage facility. The buildings had real farming equipment visible in yards, tractors that occasionally moved to maintain the illusion. But inside the barns were stacks of artillery shells. Inside the storage sheds were field guns. Beneath what looked like hayricks were fuel dumps. The artillery pieces were unloaded into storage, catalogued by staff who worked entirely indoors to avoid being seen from above. Within 48 hours, they'd be loaded onto another train for movement to an army unit forming in Kent. The entire operation from factory to frontline unit never touched a mainline railway. German intelligence studying their maps had no way of tracking this movement because on their maps the route didn't exist. They knew something was wrong. The mathematics didn't add up. Luftwaffe bombers had hit every major marshalling yard in southern England. Reconnaissance photos showed destroyed buildings, cratered tracks, burned-out locomotives. Yet British Army units continued to move. Equipment continued to reach ports. The supply chain hadn't collapsed. Something was sustaining British logistics and German intelligence couldn't identify what. Several theories circulated through Abwehr offices. Some analysts suggested the British were using roads far more than estimated. This didn't withstand scrutiny. Road movement of heavy equipment was slow, inefficient, and conspicuous. German reconnaissance would have spotted convoys of tank transporters. Others proposed that British railways simply repaired damage faster than Germany credited. This was partly true. British railway workers performed miracles of improvisation, but their efforts alone couldn't explain the discrepancy. The closest anyone came to the truth was a Luftwaffe intelligence assessment from December 1940. An analyst noted that reconnaissance photos of certain industrial areas showed what might be rail spurs serving factories, but the spurs didn't connect to any mapped railway line. The analyst theorized these might be internal factory tramways. The report was filed and forgotten. The idea that Britain had constructed hundreds of miles of hidden strategic railways simply seemed too elaborate, too expensive, too effectively concealed to be credible. German military doctrine emphasized offensive action and visible strength. A massive defensive infrastructure project designed never to be seen violated their entire approach to warfare. One particularly close call tested the system's security in August 1941. A German reconnaissance aircraft, flying at unusually low altitude after getting separated from its formation, passed directly over a strategic depot in Wiltshire at the exact moment a train was being loaded. The crew spotted the train and photographed it. The resulting image clearly showed a locomotive, multiple wagons, and obviously military supplies being loaded. The photograph reached intelligence analysts who immediately recognized its significance. For 3 weeks, Strategic Reserve Railway System staff waited for German bombing raids targeting that depot. Security officials considered whether the entire section of network near the compromised depot needed to be abandoned. Then captured documents from a German aircraft shot down over the channel revealed what happened. The reconnaissance crew's report had been filed incorrectly. The photograph had been catalogued as showing a conventional railway depot, and the location had been misidentified due to navigation errors. The Germans believed they'd photographed a facility near Southampton when they'd actually been over a location 40 miles inland. They bombed what they thought was the target, hit empty fields, and never realized their mistake. The system had survived discovery through enemy error, but operational security couldn't rely on luck. Protocols tightened. Camouflage netting over loading areas doubled. Procedures ensured no train remained stationary in partially covered positions during daylight. The invisible railway would stay invisible, not through German incompetence but through British obsession with detail. By 1942, the nature of the war in Britain had changed. The Blitz had ended as Germany redirected air power to support the invasion of the Soviet Union. British skies became quieter, though the threat of renewed bombing always remained. The strategic railway network's role evolved. Instead of providing redundancy for damaged conventional lines, it increasingly became the primary means of moving strategically sensitive material. When the first Churchill tanks emerged from production, they traveled to testing grounds via strategic lines. When radar equipment, still highly classified, needed transport from factories to coastal installations, the Ghost network provided secure movement. The system had become not just a backup but the preferred method for anything the British military wanted to keep hidden. The build-up to D-Day in 1943 and 1944 put unprecedented demands on the network. Southern England became a massive military depot as men and equipment concentrated for the invasion of France. Moving this material without revealing invasion scale and location required elaborate deception. The Strategic Reserve Railway System played a crucial role. Equipment destined for actual invasion ports moved on strategic lines, while decoy traffic on conventional railways suggested different embarkation points. German intelligence watching conventional railway movements through aerial reconnaissance and agent reports. concluded the invasion would likely target the Pas-de-Calais region. This matched nicely with railway traffic they could observe. What they couldn't see was the massive flow of material moving along hidden routes to ports in Hampshire and Dorset. Tanks traveled under camouflage nets. Artillery pieces moved in trains that never appeared on any German tracking. The deception held until Allied troops were wading ashore on Normandy beaches, and even then, German commanders struggled to understand how such massive forces had concentrated without corresponding railway movements being detected. Post-invasion, the strategic network's importance gradually declined. With Allied air superiority over Britain firmly established, the risk of German bombing had effectively vanished. The elaborate camouflage remained in place through habit and continued security concerns, but operational tempo on strategic lines decreased. Some sections were eventually connected to the conventional network, becoming branch lines serving industrial areas. Others were abandoned, rails pulled up, rights-of-way returned to agriculture or forestry. The trains that never existed faded back into the landscape that had hidden them. Declassification came in stages through the 1970s and 1980s, revealing scope that astonished even military historians. Between 1940 and 1945, the strategic railway network moved over 2 million tons of military material. It operated roughly 15,000 individual train movements without a single instance of confirmed detection by German intelligence. The construction cost, adjusted for inflation, exceeded $2 billion. The operational cost, including camouflage maintenance and inefficiency from using longer routes, added perhaps 20% to Britain's wartime railway expenses. The system represented something beyond physical transportation capacity. It provided certainty. Military planners could count on being able to move critical material regardless of what the Luftwaffe did. For the railway workers who spent years operating trains that officially didn't exist, the experience was peculiar and isolating. They couldn't tell families where they worked. They couldn't take pride in achievements that had to remain secret. Some carried their silence to graves, having signed Official Secrets Act documents that never released them from confidentiality. Thomas Webb, the engineer who drove that artillery train through Sherwood Forest in September 1940, lived until 1983. Only in the final year of his life, after initial declassifications, could he finally tell his grandchildren what he'd actually done during the war. He'd driven trains through darkness, under nets, past fake buildings, and through landscapes manufactured to deceive. He'd been part of Britain's most successful secret, a railway system that won the war by never being found. The few physical remnants that survive are unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know what they're looking at. An overgrown embankment that seems oddly well engineered for a farm track. A cutting through forest too straight to be natural, but too far from any mapped railway to make sense. Concrete plinths in fields that once supported camouflage netting poles. These fragments are evidence of a secret kept so well that the enemy never understood what they were missing. They're proof that Britain ran a parallel railway network through the entire war, moving the material that kept the military functioning, and did it all without Hitler knowing where to aim his bombs. The ultimate measure of the Strategic Reserve Railway System's success is elegantly simple. The Germans never destroyed it because they never found it. In warfare, the target you can't identify is the target you can't kill. Britain built railways that couldn't be identified, and those invisible tracks kept rolling through every night of the Blitz, through every crisis, through every moment when conventional wisdom said rail transport was too vulnerable to rely upon. The trains ran in darkness under nets through camouflaged landscapes, carrying the shells and tanks and fuel that turned the tide. They ran until victory, hidden in plain sight, winning the war one invisible journey at a time. The greatest deception isn't making your enemy see something that isn't there. It's making them believe there's nothing to see at all.